would like to start with introductions. Our Mayor, Mayor Catherine Pugh, Comptroller Joan Pratt, Solicitor Andre Davis, and Director of Public Works Rudy Chow. Before I turn it over to Director of Finance Henry Raymond, Madam Mayor wanted to have a few remarks. Madam Mayor.
Well, we're looking forward to the presentation of the budget, and hopefully you all in your agencies will be pleased. If not, we know that you'll work with us because we're utilizing our resources in a way that we feel will be productive for the city and will help us to move the city forward. I want to also take a moment, Mr. President, to thank our Violence Reduction Initiative team that come in from all of the different agencies. Can you all stand up for just a second? Oh, were you? Oh, see you. Oh, Jack wants to say something as well.
Yes, I'm going to say. First of all, I was going to thank the mayor for her violence reduction initiative with all of the departments coming together to service the 7 zones. We've seen a great reduction in crime. We saw a lot of people applying for jobs and those kind of things, and it's really, really working. I had an interview this morning with the Sun reporter talking about all of the positive things that are happening with the Mayor's Violence Reduction Initiative. And I think it's really working, and I want to commend the police department for their part in it and all the departments, but most of all, thank the mayor for her vision. People said it wasn't a crime plan, but they're seeing now that her crime plan is in action and is reducing violence in the city of Baltimore. With that, I would like to turn it over to Director of Finance, Henry Raymond.
Can we just, one other acknowledgement, and that's to Parks and Recreation. All 3 of us had an opportunity to attend the opening of Shake and Bake, and it was through the diligent effort of our Parks and Recreation Department that we were able to get that done. We didn't wait for the state's budget to come out. We thought that it was important. It's an important piece of our neighborhoods and communities, and so we pulled together utilizing our resources to make it happen. We've still got a lot more investment to make over there, but Reggie, we would just want to give a shout out. Thank you.
Okay. We turn it over to you, Bob?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, now we'll turn it over to Bob.
Yes, thank you, and good morning, everybody. My name is Bob Senemy. I'm the budget director for the city, and first I'd like to welcome the members of the Board of Estimates today, and also welcome our agency heads and their designees and our fiscal staff who are sprinkled throughout the audience today. Today's presentation is a briefing to the Board of Estimates on the preliminary budget, which was released last Wednesday. We also have another event tonight, which is Taxpayers Night. It's also an event for the Board of Estimates that's focused on citizen feedback. So the charter requires us to have 2 presentations for the board on the budget. First one here today with agency heads present, and tonight with citizens. So what I'll do is I'll run through the presentation. It should be anywhere between 30 and 45 minutes. And then from there, I'll pause and I'll ask for questions from the board.
30 minutes max.
Okay.
We get ADD up here.
And then I'll welcome questions from the board on our preliminary budget. And if there are financial questions, we'll do our best to answer those. If there's anything more operational, agency heads are here to answer those questions. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. So our agenda for today, we have 5 topics. First, I'll give a brief overview of the budget at just a very high level. Next, we'll back up and we'll look at what we call our current level of service forecast, which we did in the fall. A little bit more detail about how that shook out and how we did the planning process this year. Then we'll go into detail on the revenue side, the outlook, our fixed costs this year, and then we'll talk about our budget recommendations by pillar, by each of the mayor's 5 pillars. Okay. So first, an overview of the budget, just at a high level by the numbers. The operating plan for fiscal 19 is recommended at $2.8 billion. That's a 2% increase from fiscal 18. The capital plan is recommended at $618.4 million. That's a 44.7% decline from fiscal 18, but keep in mind that the capital budget fluctuates quite a bit each year based on project timing, access to the bond market. It's especially true on the utility side, where they front load many projects and then they drop off in the following year. So that's not a change in service. In the capital budget on the general fund side, our investment from city-backed funds, general fund-backed funds, which includes GO bonds, county transportation bonds, and some PAYGO capital, It exceeds $105 million this year, which is the highest level of investment we've had since pre-Great Recession levels. On the general fund in particular, the recommended amount is $1.88 billion. That's a 2.6% increase from fiscal 18. And there's an increase of 170 positions in this year's budget, and we'll talk a little bit about what those are a bit later. Just top level overview of the budget, we have $370 million of support for city schools. We have a variety of new strategies to support the mayor's violence reduction initiative, including funding to restore funding for 100 police positions. We have funding in the capital budget to get started on the digital transformation plan from MOIT. We're maintaining core city services across the board. I know agencies were asked to submit 2% reduction options. We did take some of those options, but we were very selective. We wanted to minimize the service impact to citizens. We're expanding the speed in the red light camera program, expanding the Safe Streets program, and we have our next contribution into the Children and Youth Fund, which is $12.4 million. We're also increasing EMS fees in the fire department. The fiscal 19, so backing up to the fall, when we did our projection this year, what we call our current level of service projection in the fall, we had $45 million of expected revenue growth and $35 million of expenditure growth. That left us in a much better position than we've been in prior years. We started the plan this year, the planning process, with a very modest $10 million surplus. And so on the revenue side, we had increases in commercial assessments, income tax, and traffic cameras. On the expenditure side, we built in cost of living adjustments for all unions, a 2% projected COLA. We updated our projections for health benefits, our contributions into our pension funds, and so we were left with a $10 million surplus. So when we started the planning process, we were in a good position. We had the flexibility to add some new initiatives, try to find ways to offset those costs so that we stay on a fiscally sustainable path, and then free up some additional money for one-time investments, and we'll come back to that in a bit. So zeroing in on the revenue side of the budget, this first pie chart just shows the sources of money in the general fund. Focus on the general fund now. You can see that half of the money comes from our property tax revenue, 18.8% comes from income tax, and then the next two slices, highway user revenue, state aid. Those are sources that come from the state. So we're definitely very highly dependent on property tax revenue and income tax revenue. Those burdens fall primarily, completely on our citizens, on our residents. Overall general fund revenue is projected at $1.882 billion in fiscal 19. This is $300 million higher than pre-recession levels. So we think of fiscal 11 as kind of like the bottom point of when we faced the worst crisis that the city has had in many years financially. And since then, our revenues are up by $300 million overall from that level. Reason for concern, though, is that we're about 9 years into an economic recovery, and so we know that can't last forever. So even though the picture has been good for the last few years, we are cautious and we are prepared for if a downturn hits us in the next few years. On property tax, the low point of our property tax coming out of the last recession was in fiscal 13. It takes us a little longer to get there because of the phase-in of assessments, but since fiscal 13, our property tax has grown 23%. And the reason for that is that each year, one group, there are 3 groups in the city, each year one of those groups gets reassessed, and you can see that from 2010 to 2014, each year we had declines in our assessed value when those properties were reassessed, but since then we've now had 5 straight years of assessment growth. One area of concern, though, you'll notice that the growth for Group 3, which is assessed for the 2019 budget, is only 3.6%. That's made up of 8.5% commercial property tax growth, and residential growth was actually flat in that group. Group 3, if you can see on the map there, is that southern part of the city. So it includes some of the harbor neighborhoods, includes South Baltimore, far South Baltimore, Southwest Baltimore, and parts of West Baltimore. We found that some neighborhoods did very well, but some properties actually lost value. It's something that we're keeping our eyes on. We had traditionally never appealed residential properties, but we have done that for a select number of properties, and we'll be looking more to do that in the future, because there are properties that are losing value that we feel were assessed too low given the market conditions. So it is reason for concern that even though we've had growth, the growth has started to slow a bit on property taxes. We have a program, what we call the Targeted Homeowners Tax Credit. You might have heard this referred to as 20 cents by 2020. This was started years ago as a incremental property tax reduction program for owner-occupied properties, so folks that own their homes and live in the city. We wanted to target our limited tax relief to those folks because for those folks that live in the city and own their homes. And what this does is, even though it's a credit, it has the effect of reducing the tax rate that the effective tax rate that those folks pay. And so since 2012, when we started the program, we have reduced taxes for those residents by the equivalent of about 17 cents on a base tax rate of 2.24%. That's a 7% tax rate reduction. For the average homeowner, that's saving them about $270 on their tax bill. So again, we are not in a position to slash our rate and match what the counties, the surrounding counties offer, but we have done the best we can to chip away at that tax rate and try to take some of the burden off of our citizens. The program will end in fiscal 20, and then from there we'll need to reevaluate it. We would love to provide more tax relief, but of course that's dependent on our fiscal situation at that point. So the plan was to get to a 20-cent reduction by 2020, and then we'll reevaluate that going into the 2021 budget. On income tax, our income tax base has slowly gotten stronger over the past few years. It's an interesting story. All the data that we see, census data and state income tax return data, shows that our base has gotten stronger. We do have higher net earner residents living in the city. We did get over-distributed by the state in fiscal 16 and 17, so we're paying for that in 18. Our 18 budget was $350 million. Our expected receipts are closer to $340 million. But if you look at $340 million versus the $353 million projection in 19, that's about 2.5% growth, which is roughly what other counties, other parts of the state are experiencing. So we are matching the state's growth, which is good news for the city. Going back years ago, we used to assume that if the state income tax base grew by 4%, we would only grow at 2%. And what we're seeing now is that we're at least matching the state growth, which is good news for the city. Highway user revenues has been slow, steady, and frankly a bit disappointing for us. What you don't see in this chart is that prior to this chart, going back to 2007, we were generating over $200 million of highway user revenue. During the recession, the state siphoned some of that money away to balance their own general fund issues, and since that time, the growth has been slow and steady, but it really hasn't generated much. And so this is something that the local jurisdictions in Maryland continue to advocate for at the state to get some of that money back. Seems like there was some progress in this session, but we won't see anything, it looks like, until 2020. We don't expect anything different in fiscal 19 for now. We're still sorting that out. Speed cameras and red light violations. So as you can see from this chart, it's been a bumpy ride, no pun intended. We had a program peaked, our old program peaked in fiscal 12, and then of course, if folks remember, since that time, that program was shut down because we had issues with it, and from fiscal 14 to fiscal 17, we were generating virtually no money, no revenue from that program. The program was restarted in fiscal 18, and the year we're in now, we only budgeted $7.9 million in 18 just because of the uncertainty of the program. So far, so good. We're generating well in excess of that. And DOT also announced in March that they would be expanding the program further, adding 44 additional cameras. So we increased our projection for 19. We'll expect to generate $23.9 million of revenue. Just want to note, though, that comes with $8 million of expenses on the DOT side to pay the vendors to monitor the program. So the net proceeds to the city is actually about $16 million when you include expenses. We're trying to be very cautious on this side. We can't rely on this revenue. Seeing the trend we've had over time, we're trying to be cautious. Our experience has been that you turn a camera on, you generate quite a bit of revenue, and then very quickly the amount of citations we issue declines because residents, get used to they know they're there and they get a ticket and they know to slow down. That is the intent of the program, of course, is to slow people down and improve our safety. But from a financial perspective, we have to be careful not to rely too much on this revenue. For casinos, so our fiscal 18 budget was frankly very uncertain because we were not sure how the opening of the new casino in Prince George's County would affect revenues. So we were relying on state projections that frankly were a little bit overstated. Now that we've seen our experience in 18, the revenues have tailed off a bit because of the opening of that casino, and our 19 budget I think is more reflective of what we'll actually receive. From the bottom to the top, on this chart in fiscal 19, we're getting $13.5 million from the operator of the Horseshoe Casino. That's a payment directly to the city's general fund. That next bar, $13 million, is the local impact aid that gets used in the 1 mile radius of the Horseshoe Casino. Half of that goes directly to a community benefits organization, half comes to the city to manage services around that area. The 5.6 is in Pimlico Park Heights. That has to be used in the 1 mile radius of the racetrack. Most of that goes to capital investment in the Park Heights neighborhood. 5.5 of table game revenue gets split between rec and parks and school construction. And then that final piece at the top, the 3.2, goes to the general fund. That's a payment on the garage, the property tax on the garage. So again, lower than fiscal 18, but I think more reflective of the reality of how casino revenues have settled in now that all three are open in Maryland. Turning to the fixed cost in the budget. So when we talk about the general fund, we look at 5 big categories that we consider fixed. By fixed, we mean that we either required to pay those by law or by contract. The blue bar is pension contributions for the ERS and the F&P pension fund. The red is our required contribution to city schools, maintenance of effort. The purple is retiree health benefits. The green bar is debt service. That's principal and interest payments on prior borrowing that we've done in previous years. And that light blue other is a variety of other things: workers' compensation, risk management, utility costs, things that you really just can't turn off if you want to run the city. The good news for us has been that our fixed costs have remained at a low level as compared to our revenues. And if you notice, back in fiscal 12, our fixed costs consumed 48% of our revenues, and now they're only consuming 43% of our general fund revenues. That's because of a lot of the reforms we did, the pension reform and the health benefits reform. And the good news on that is that frees up more money for discretionary spending for agencies that directly impacts our citizens. On pensions in particular, the blue bar here, you'll notice that's our contribution to our civilian pension system. It's flat from 18 to 19. Again, we have new employees are entering a more cost-effective pension system. They're entering what they call the retirement savings plan system, or a hybrid plan where they choose between RSP and a small defined benefit. That is that's lessening the city's risk, and it's giving the employee, we think, a good benefit that's portable. On the F&P side, the growth was $4 million from 18 to 19. Of course, the risk here is we're still locked in this legal dispute with the unions about the reforms that go all the way back to 2010. If we're to ultimately lose that lawsuit, that would be a big problem for the city. We would owe retroactive payments and potentially tens of millions of dollars of additional contributions going forward. So it's something we're monitoring very closely. The limited growth on both the blue line here and the red line is also helped by the fact that we had strong investment returns in the pension funds in the year that ended in fiscal 17. That's not always the case, though. Our benchmark is 7.5%. Sometimes we exceed that. Sometimes we fall short of it. This year it happened to benefit us because we had a strong fiscal 17 year. On health benefits, in fiscal 13, we reformed active employee health benefits and retiree health benefits, and we generated significant savings for the city. The gray line here shows what our health benefit costs would have been without any reforms. If the cost of our programs just grew with the rate of healthcare inflation in the general market. The green line shows what our actual costs have been. And you'll notice we got a nice savings in fiscal 13 and 14, and then an additional significant savings heading into the 19 budget. That's because we rebid our healthcare contracts. Our prescription drug contract had not been rebid in almost a decade, so we generated significant savings from that competition. And our medical plans were consolidated. We had 9. We consolidated that into 4. So there are less options for employees, but we found that there were a few plans on the periphery that had very few enrollees, and we were paying very high administrative costs for those plans. So the combination of that, those two actions saved us $35 million overall, 20 in the general fund, which is great news for the city, and is actually what has allowed us to free us some investment in some of these initiatives that we'll talk about in a moment. Our unfunded liabilities in F&P in ERS and OPEB have declined from fiscal 11 versus fiscal 17. Again, the concern there is our pension funds, especially over time, which we talked about with F&P in particular. Okay, so that's the revenue and just the fixed side of it. I'll close with a couple highlights of budget recommendations that touch many of the agencies here. So first, I wanted to go through the new initiatives that are in the budget this year, run through these quickly, and talk about how we offset those new costs. So these are some of the highlights of the budget this year. So when we planned new initiatives, the focus, of course, was on violence prevention, public safety in particular. So first, we made an adjustment of $14 million in the police department. That we're restoring funding for 100 police officer positions, and then there's an additional adjustment of $5.5 million to reverse a cut that was done in the 18 budget. Our experience with police has been that police is an active partner in everything that we're doing on violence reduction. They have exceeded their budget in the last 4 years, but we need to realistically get them to a level of what the spending is. We still have a high expectation for police that they will get some of their costs under control, especially overtime. I know folks here have read the news. There has been some abuse of overtime. We have plans in place to try to address that through an overtime audit, through technology, and through better oversight. So the way we looked at it is police is spending at this level. They're only budgeted here, and we needed to make an adjustment, but we need them to help meet us somewhere in the middle. So we did make an adjustment for police totaling $14 million. Those additional 100 officer positions, we won't be able to fill them all at once. We still have some vacancies even in their current budget, but we have turned the curve basically. That we had a year last year, a calendar year, where we just barely had more hires than we did attrition. So some of the work that the innovation team has done to help them with the recruiting is starting to bear some fruit. Our preference is always to have a filled police officer position as opposed to overtime. So even though those positions can't all be filled at once, our preference is to have a filled position rather than spend on overtime, and to do those things I mentioned to reduce our overtime cost over time. We'll be expanding the Safe Streets program from 4 sites to 10. That's a $3.6 million cost. The ROCA program is coming to Baltimore. It's $1 million of general fund money. There's a variety of private funding that is going to that program. It will serve 75 young men in the first year in fiscal 19. We got a grant from Bloomberg, a $5 million grant to purchase crime fight technology, but we had to budget $1 million of operating expenses to support that ongoing. That's license plate readers, crime cameras, and gunshot detection units. In the crime lab in police, we're investing 10 new positions to more quickly and efficiently gather gun and ballistics evidence to enter into a national database, which we believe will help our crime fight, get us quicker matches if we find something that helps our investigative units. VRI, Violence Reduction Initiative, we're calling this VRI Rapid Response. As folks in this room know, many agencies have been asked to more rapidly respond to service requests in those VRI zones. And what we found through our analysis that we needed to make an adjustment and give the agencies a bit of extra money to handle that so we could maintain that level of service. The agencies that got additional money here was DPW for 2 crews, some additional inspectors in HCD, and also extended hours at a handful of rec centers in those VRI zones. We increased the homeless services budget by $2 million. That's additional outreach workers and winter sheltering. We have a variety of new positions, the outreach workers and homeless services, a new Office of African American Male Engagement, some communication folks, and a handful of others sprinkled throughout agencies. We're investing $900,000 to have around-the-clock support of our dispatch systems, and we have $500,000 in the budget to support students in Baltimore City that would like to go to Baltimore City Community College. Most of those students do get federal aid. Our funding is to match, is to provide that last dollar to get them to college. That will support 500 students over a 2-year period. On the offset side, so in the savings side, I'd mentioned before the savings from our health contracts. We also asked agencies to make trims to give us options for reductions to their budget. It ended up totaling $4.7 million, and again, we were very careful with how we chose those. We wanted to minimize service impacts to agencies. We're increasing EMS fees by $1 million. Our rates are still below the surrounding jurisdictions, and we're counting on, it looks like at this point we can count on some additional state aid. The state budget process looks like it has broken in our favor. One thing that the governor wanted to do was he wanted to push some of the State Department of Assessment cost onto local jurisdictions. That was pushed back by local jurisdictions, so we can count on $2 million of savings there, and there might be some things in the state budget that will still benefit us going forward. I think we can count on $2 million and maybe a little bit more. We'll find that out when it wraps up next week. With that $10 million planning surplus that we started with, we invested $6.4 of that money into additional capital projects. We invested $2 million in additional funds for the schools for building and maintenance to start to help address some of the issues that they face this year with HVAC and maintenance. We put $1 million in MOED to backfill what appeared to be a loss of federal funding. As the federal budget has shaken out, we'll have to go back and revisit that and see if we still need that money, but for now we have $1 million to backfill what we looked would be a potential loss of federal funding that could have forced us to close one of our career centers, so we won't do that in fiscal 19. And then we're investing $750,000 in what we call NERV centers, strategic command centers in our eastern and western police districts. The idea being getting some expertise and technology to get a technology closer to the ground, closer to our officers, so we can more rapidly get that intelligence out to officers on the street. That's a one-time cost to get those ready, and then going forward we will manage those ourselves with our expertise that we gather from our consultant. Just a couple highlights on grants. We're still, between the preliminary budget and the final budget, we get the final state budget. We learn what's happening on the federal level, so we will make some adjustments to these. I won't go through all these in detail, but state grants, some examples include funding for libraries, for the health department, for convention center and police. On the federal side, we get quite a bit of money for our health department, for human services, homeless services in particular, CDBG and housing, Head Start, and some grant money for fire. And on the special fund side, most of our special funds in the budget are what we call special revenue funds, where we receive revenue that has to be dedicated to a particular agency, things like EMS fees and fire. But there also are a handful of private foundation grants, grants we get from private sources, either educational institutions, foundations, or other private citizens, businesses too. The big one being this year, the Bloomberg grant, of course, the $5 million, of which a portion is funded and is budgeted in fiscal 19. On the utility side, operating costs are flat versus fiscal 18. There is the next wave of rate increases that will go into place in fiscal 19 on the water and wastewater side. Stormwater rates are expected to be flat this year. And again, the story there we know is that with the consent decree that we're under, there has been an extraordinary amount of capital investment that's been required to bring our infrastructure up to speed. I'll close with just a couple highlights in the budget around the mayor's 5 pillars. So when we planned the budget this year, there was a focus, of course, on public safety, but we did not lose sight of the other pillars: education and youth engagement, accountability and transparency, quality of life, and economic development and jobs. For those who have been around for a few years, you know that we like to frame the budget not only in terms of the dollars, but in terms of what we're getting for the money. And so I'll close with a couple highlights for each of those pillars of what we're spending and also what we're getting for that investment. So in public safety, of course, we talked about the ROCA program and the Safe Streets expansion. And here, I won't go through these all, but you can see here are some of the things that our investments are getting us. We talked about the 100 new sworn police officer positions, and I'll mention the 95% target for City Watch cameras of being up and readily available, which that Bloomberg grant will help with. On education and youth, so we'll make our second contribution, charter required now, into the Children and Youth Fund. It's $12.4 million in fiscal 19. On schools, we are providing a total of $370 million to city schools, which is really extraordinary. It includes operating support for maintenance of effort. It includes capital investment. It includes the maintenance dollars that I talked about earlier. It includes a contribution to the 21st Century Schools Building Fund. And it includes direct services that the city pays for in support of city schools, like crossing guards and the school nurse program. So last year, we had agreed, the city had agreed, the mayor had made a commitment to bridge them. It was a $90 million commitment over 3 years. Really, it's an extraordinary commitment to keep them whole while we wait for the state to figure out these education funding formulas. The state has done some work on that. They've shared some results. They haven't figured out how they want to pay for some of the changes, but that will be coming in the forthcoming years. In the meantime, what we're doing, I think, is really extraordinary for the schools. And on the performance side, again, it's just some of the things we get with our money. Visits to outdoor pools, library programs, youth works programs, out of school time programs. We're serving many kids and many of our citizens with these investments. On quality of life, we talked about that rapid response service among agencies and also homeless services, increased funding. And again, you can see the types of impact we're having with our money. Summer food program, housing demolition, senior centers, the virtual supermarket program and health, and plus many more. These are the types of things that we're accomplishing with our dollars, with our investments. On economic development and jobs, mostly baseline level of service. Most of the money in economic development jobs goes towards MOED to support our career center network, including a one mobile workforce center. Money that goes to the convention center and Visit Baltimore to encourage visitors to Baltimore, which generates additional economic impact. And then BDC, of course, their programs, tax credits, loans, outreach programs to retain and attract new jobs to Baltimore. And finally, on the accountability and transparency side, which is mostly internal services, we're making our first investment into the digital transformation plan. That's money in the capital budget. And then we're in the midst of the separation between HABC and HCD. So there's additional money in HCD's budget this year to handle the split. We felt that because the missions of those organizations are different, it was best to have those as separate organizations. And on the performance side, internally, the types of things that we're doing, we're making data sets available on Open Baltimore. We're addressing calls through our 311 system. And engaging residents in the budget planning process. That's something that we've taken a deep interest in. We've had a series of events, including the one tonight, to get more citizens engaged in the process. So with that, I think I'm at the half hour, or hopefully I got close, and I would be happy to take questions from the board members about the presentation, and if there's anything for the agency heads as well, they're here to answer those questions.
I just want to thank you for this budget, which keeps core services intact. The only issue that I have is when we talk about raising water rates, until we find out exactly how much money that we actually have, I don't think we should be even entertaining increasing water rates on the citizens of Baltimore. We need to know the exact amount, because we really don't know. Madam Controller?
Yeah, I'd just like to thank Bob and the Finance Department for presenting a balanced budget. I also like to thank the mayor for the fiscal 19 outlook, new initiatives for emphasizing violence reduction, because it is definitely money well spent. Citizens feel safer, and we have more visitors coming to the city, which impacts the city and businesses. And I'm pleased with this budget.
Okay, thank you.
Let me also say thank you for a balanced budget. One of the things that you heard was how the dedication to education that we've made in this budget. But I want to reemphasize that the school city's operating budget is $1.3 billion, and that about 60-some-odd% of their budget actually comes from the state. Unlike our police department, where they only get maybe 1% of your budget comes from the state. And as many of you are agencies who are always looking for other ways to fund your budgets, know what you get from the state, and how the health department, for example, depends a great deal on grants to their particular agency. And so I'm really grateful for the commitment that we've made, and I believe that this is a transformative budget. I wanted to address just momentarily, and we'll probably address it a little bit later on, Mr. President, around our water system. We have had an audit, but we will make some changes as it relates to how we are looking at our water system. And then the other thing that most folks here don't know is how we capitalize our water system, because we're under a federal mandate to fix it. 100 pipes bursting in 1 week is just not acceptable. But at the same time, we've got to be very prudent, as the President says, in terms of how we look at our water system and how we make the changes that are necessary, because anytime you are improving something, it does come at a cost. But we want to be prudent in how we go about doing that. And so as the many findings that came from that audit, I'll talk to you a little bit later about how we're going to address those. But I also wanted to say thank you for how we looked at the violence reduction initiatives. And I think that we would be, and thank you, Mr. President, for acknowledging that we had a plan from the very beginning, but plans cost money. And making sure that we properly address those and look at them from a financial standpoint, I think will make a difference in terms of how we move forward. So thank you so much for this. We appreciate it.
Sure. If there's no
Any more comments?
I'd like to just make the next steps in the process before we close. So again, a reminder, tonight is our taxpayer night. I know folks, Jessica Clark is coordinating. Can you just raise your hand, Jess? If anybody wants to participate in that, she's been coordinating for our staff. I know some agencies will be sending folks to help in that process, which we greatly appreciate. So that event is tonight. The next step in the process is we'll review feedback from the board, from the public. We'll present the final budget. The Board of Estimates will vote on the final budget on May 2nd. From there, it will get introduced into City Council. They'll hold public hearings on it. It looks like the week around after Memorial Day is tentatively when those hearings will be scheduled. Our staff will be reaching out to agencies. Of course, we put together a much more detailed book with more detail on each agency budgets, what we call the agency detail budget. It's actually 2 volumes. We'll be working with folks on that over the next few weeks. And I just remind agencies that we still will be publishing that service level performance information. So we'll be giving more guidance on how to prepare for that work and those hearings coming up in May. And if that's it, I have nothing else.
We thank
Okay.
your staff as well.
Thank you. This concludes the meeting. The next meeting of the Board of Estimates will be tonight at 6 p.m. for the annual Taxpayers Night in the War Memorial. BBMR will have a presentation at 6 p.m. and the board will meet at 7 p.m. Thank you.